right. Good morning, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City of the Immaculata. Back with you. I am listening to Chauncey Dog over in the corner. He just started dreaming, and it sounds like it's a pretty intense dream. It's probably dreaming of fire hydrants and kittens, but you guys will just have to ignore his glee, his gleeful puppy sounds as he dreams. Funny thing about today's live is that it was supposed to be last week. Now, if you guys are following any of the podcasts, well, for one, if you're newer here, what's going on with some of the podcasts that you see me releasing? These were previous lives that I had recorded, some of them over a year ago at this point. I have had several people, reach out to me and say, hey, can you make your content available through podcasts? That's how we like to consume this material. And so I finally got around, started doing that. So I'm re-releasing old lives. Now, the previous two podcasts that I put out were the truth about traditionalism, as well as the crisis in the real crisis in the Catholic Church. And I was listening to it. I didn't realize that this had happened, but that one actually came out a year ago. And I know it came out a year ago because I say at the beginning, I'm kind of reflecting on the fact that that live itself was supposed to come out a week earlier. And then it ended up I don't even remember what the circumstances were. I had to push it forward. So when I actually did that live, it fell on March 25th, the Feast of the Annunciation, which is a day of like real significance for me. And it was a day that was actually significant to the theme of that live, the real crisis in the church. And the funny thing is, I didn't plan that, of course. And the fact it getting pushed forward, I think, was something that was out of my hands circumstantially. And so the funny thing is, like, the same thing has happened again. This live should have been last week, but instead I had that live placed last week because something came up that was out of my hands. So I just sort of switched where I had things set. But it also ties in, and I'm convinced that these things are providential. They're not like, it's not my St. Paul get knocked off of my horse kind of moments. I think we all have these little, like the little flowers that Therese speaks of, right? These little things that happen along the way that if you're paying attention to, you can see the Holy Spirit at work. Because this live that I'm doing today is actually a very good sequel to what I was discussing in the live last week in that podcast. And I didn't plan it that way. It's happened to like turn out like that. So I'm thinking back on it now, and it's like, okay, well, that live itself got pushed, and now this live got pushed. So it kind of works out. And that one actually seems to have resonated with a few of you. So I appreciate all of you guys that are going back and listening to those podcasts as I release them. And if you listen to the one last week, this will be a good transition into the one this week. And I wanted to begin today by addressing this tendency that we have to view the satanic, the diabolical, in a almost strictly medieval artistic sense. Now, while I think that drastic representations of evil and hell have a place and a use, especially for people that are sort of caught up in the grips of mortal sin, I do think there is a place for these like jarring images of hell sometimes to maybe shock people out of complacency. I also think that it tends to make us overlook the more subtle, dare I say, more common means that Satan uses to infiltrate our lives and our culture, as it were. There's an old movie from the 90s. I probably haven't seen it since the early 2000s. So, who knows if it even holds up. For those of you that go back and watch it and, you say, hey, this is a horrible movie. Why did you recommend it? Sometimes these movies, we have like our memory of them. They don't age well. But it has Al Pacino in it. Al Pacino's a fine actor. And he's portraying in this movie the devil. The devil disguised as a lawyer. The movie's called The Devil's Advocate, actually. And like I said, it may be a ridiculous film today. If it doesn't hold up, I don't know, hold it against me. But, Al Pacino could actually take a flawed film pretty far just by his skill alone. But regardless, I think the context of the film is kind of pertinent to what I was thinking about for today's live, because Satan in this film doesn't come off after he doesn't come after the protagonist as this like monstrous demon figure that we would all see and spot, coming from a mile away. He actually comes in a way that the protagonist would be more willing to invite him in because he comes with certain offers and promises of the thing that the protagonist seeks. Promises of things that in themselves are, as it may pertain to our lives on a wider scale, are not in them, are not often in themselves bad or evil as such. But Satan likes to offer these things as the way to thwart ends and means of things. Now, Christ is very clear that we are to seek first the kingdom of God and then all else. Satan kind of comes along and inverts that process, right? We're first to turn our gaze towards the things of this world, and then if we have time to get around to Christ. But what we know that actually happens in instances where we seek first the things of this world, what ends up happening is that we leave God off to the side altogether, right? So I'm actually going to come at this from a different angle than I think that what you would probably get from others. Because I think that most others go after the most obvious targets. Even the ones that seem to think that they're onto something, like, you get these characters that are online that are speaking of, evil grand government psyops, psychological operations. Even they tend to get lost in all of this. So, to lay it on the table for you, today we're going to focus on what I believe are the two greatest threats to Catholicism, the two greatest threats to the faith as it relates to you as an individual and as a Catholicism as a communal experience. And they aren't members of the Satanic Temple per se. They aren't New Agers who buy, Ouija boards from the GameStop. They aren't like women in their yoga studios. All of these I think are symptomatic. They're not causative. The root of all of these, I believe, are found in the rise of secularism and indifference. Now, there's a couple of routes I want to take here by way of introduction. First, I do believe, like many historians, that the great threat of secularism in the 19th century came in the form of nationalism and Freemasonry, and that in the 20th century it was predominantly found in the rise of Bolshevism and the Communist Revolution. The great threat to the West, and don't get me wrong here, like it really was a threat. I don't want to demean the seriousness of the two threats, that existential threats that faced us from within and from without. From within, secularism as it was professed by like the Freemasons, and then from without by the rise of Marxism, not just Marxism as a theory, but as a praxis, especially in the violently potent form of Leninism. Now, before I go too far here with the history, I want to define our terms and make sure that we're actually on the same page. So let's start with secularism. What I'm not saying here is that the world, in a particular sense, does not have a mode by which it operates outside of the visible boundaries of religion. Now, we do think that there will be much overlap and that the secular should be informed by the faith, as we will get to here in a little bit. But even Christ himself says to render unto Caesar what is Caesar and unto God what is God's. So all throughout Christian history, I don't care if you're talking about Pope St. Gregory VII and his disputes with the Holy Roman Emperor. I don't care if you're talking about the Emperor Theodosius and his disputes with St. Ambrose. Heck, even King Henry VIII. All of these people they knew the distinction between church and state. Henry, remember about Henry? He made himself the head of the church in temporal affairs. Henry never made himself the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is a significant move on his part. So the church has always, as I said, recognized this distinction, not a separation, but a distinction between the church and the state, as it were. And much of the disputes that you see taking place with Gregory the Seventh, and a lot of the arguments of people that are arguing against the sort of integralism of Gregory the Seventh, failed to make the proper distinctions that Gregory was making that we can make between church and state. So one of my spiritual guides in all of this is the great Father Peter Fellner, and he locates the modern problem in the general acceptance of Immanuel Kant, a la his skeptical approach to objectivity of the intra versus the extra mental, and the belief that freedom was reliant, this is from Kant now, the belief that freedom was reliant upon a fully autonomous will, unrestrained by anything exterior, which is, of course, very different than the will according to the traditional Franciscan Scotus perspective, let alone the traditional Thomistic perspective. But Kant, being one of the instrumental influencers of modernity, not Scotus, mind you, that's a misrepresentation. You'll often hear people pinpoint the problem. I think this is one of the things that, oh gosh, what's his name? He's generally, I think, irrelevant, but the guy that founded radical orthodoxy, his name's failing me right now. But because, well, he will trace it all the way back to Scotus's just a misrepresentation of Scotus on Univocity. But anyways, I think the real thread begins in the modern world with Kant because of his views on epistemology, which end up divorcing church and state precisely because per religion, even natural religion as such, one can only expect to grasp the phenomena and never the noumena. The noumena per Kant is the thing that is the thing in its essence itself, which is eternally beyond our grasp here as sojourners. Now, Scotus recognizes a type of what we will call secularity. These are morally neutral acts rather than acts that are either, they're morally neutral acts in either politics or culture. They're neither graced nor demerited. They're neither pro nor anti-church then, right? So there is a distinction here with Scotus where he says there's this medium between the two realms. It's not a divorce. It's not what Kant does. The secularism of Kant is a choice of one over the other. The choice of secularism is actually toward an anti-church position. So in view of his position on the rationalism or irrationalism, as it were, of religion versus what he deemed the piety of faith. So Kant says because of all of this, that faith is inherently pious, it's not rational, and as a result, to be autonomous, to be free in the realm of the secular, one must make consequentially a certain anti-church move, as it were. Now, Kant wasn't against faith. He just said that it was something that's basically irrational. It relies on this fideistic pietism to justify, which is wholly in opposition to what we as Catholics would say of the faith as being sort of grounding, as the grounding source of why something is rational in the first place. But let me not digress, because where I would want to go there is a wider thing that I want to be discussing here that I'm going to have to pick up at a future date, which is grounding ourselves in the certainty of faith, which is why this topic is so pertinent to the last podcast that I did on the real crisis of the church, which, spoiler alert, if you didn't listen to last week's podcast, the real crisis of the faith in the church, in my opinion, is a crisis of uncertainty. You have to go back and listen to that. I also plan to discuss it at length in further lectures as well. But the logical fruit of all of this is once it actually takes root, once it actually seeps into the culture, I'm talking secularism now, that move towards anti-church, not secularity, but secularism, the logical outgrowth of that is the resulting indifferentism that we see. We shall know them by their fruit. Well, if the fruit of secularism is indifference, then we shouldn't have a hard time condemning the former. But if you follow the trajectory, it actually makes sense. We can't touch the noumena, it's beyond our grasp, right? Therefore, we must see the will, which in a la Kant is a radically autonomous thing. It's not constrained by anything. It's free from the constraints of something like natural law. So therefore, one should, emphasis on should, be indifferent to this or that faith, as we could never really know religious truths on any rational grounds. Now, Colby, my saint for this channel, sees indifferentism as a particularly pernicious and prevalent force in modernity. And I'm inclined to believe him at this. I mean, all one has to do is look around. And Colby was speaking at this from 100 years ago, right? Like, mind you, he doesn't even see it from the perspective that we have here in the with the what we're in the second quarter now at this point of the 21st century. Of course, in his time, I think the main players were slightly different, which I'll get to. But to continue to define our terms, I want to say that it is a failure to give glory to God, this resulting indifferentism, because of this radical secularity, which gives rise to the secularism. Atheists actually love this level of indifferentism, which is why I don't know if they're even out there anymore. I don't know if you guys still see these, but there used to be these people who had these bumper stickers that said coexist. Did you guys ever see the coexist bumper stickers? If you, and I could almost like challenge for you all, if you ever happen to find somebody that has a coexist bumper sticker, stop them and ask them which of those letters, because each letter, for those of you that don't know, each letter represents, it's a symbol of a different faith, right? Ask the people that carry those bumper stickers which of those symbols represents them and their faith. I can almost guarantee you that 99% of those people that carry that around would tell you none of them. They adhere to none of them, actually, because this coexist mentality is a byproduct of the indifferentism that exists today. Indifferentism is, going back to this idea of the will, is the will never activated by faith, never elevated by hope, and never set alight by charity. I don't care what religious faith background that you're coming from. I don't even remember what all the symbols are, so I'm going to be careful what I say here. But I think Islam is represented in the coexist bumper sticker, Judaism. I know Christianity, maybe Taoism or something like that is in there. But take whatever they were. I would take a practitioner of any one of those things over the people that would carry the coexist bumper sticker around and that mentality around, because at least they have chosen a path. And again, this goes back to what I was talking about last week with this idea of uncertainty and the world that we live in today. This idea is a perpetual state of unbelief. Mind you, it's not disbelief, rather unbelief. Disbelief, if you think about it, disbelief is like, it's like you just haven't been shown, or someone hasn't been shown the truth of something yet, right? So they see something and they're just in disbelief about it, right? I couldn't believe that this happened, so I'm in disbelief about it. It's sort of a median state between one side or the other. Unbelief, on the other hand, is a form of belief. It's I have seen and I reject. Unbelief is the child of apathy, of nihilism, of agnosticism, of atheism, of secularism, and indifference. Indifferentism then is actually a failure to offer even the natural virtue of religion to God. So this is what I'm saying, right? Like, you take even the Muslims, even the Hindus, even the tree worshipers are closer to truth by far than these people. And it's an extremely nefarious force in the world today. So now I believe, and going back to some of the historical context of all of this, right? Like, whence come all of this misery? Well, about the time that Vladimir Lenin entered his sealed train and made his way to Petrograd, our saint, Saint Maximilian Kolbe, was forming his Militia Immaculata. We spent the better part of a century fighting against the forces of that realm of secularism and atheism. And believe me, communism, Bolshevism was a real threat, and it was truly a satanic movement. The horrors of communism were more awful than you could even imagine, right? I'm not trying to like dismiss that that battle needed to take place, but concurrent to it, a different, more subtle form of secularism and indifferentism was creeping into the West. It took the shape not of this sort of, I think, blatant and obvious evil of communism, but rather in this sort of hidden pretense of wealth and opulence that existed here in the Western world. It took the form of consumerism, of libertarianism. Now, granted, the Catholic Church had been the bulwark against that for decades, even before it became clear which side would end up dominant. In the late 19th century, for example, in Germany, when Otto von Bismarck began a program called Kulturkampf, which was designed to break the Catholics' will in the former Holy Roman Empire so that the German unification process that the liberals were undertaking could go through without the deterrence of its greatest threat, the Catholic Church, right? So, for those of you that don't know, Germany used to be like these separate regions that were basically consolidated under the Holy Roman Empire. And then in the 19th century, you had a German unification movement which wanted to unite all of those things. The biggest threat to that unification movement was the Catholic Church, which is why Bismarck underwent his program of Kulturkampf to undermine Catholics in these German regions. Bismarck saw that the church stood between his dream of a unified Germany and actually that the church had the power to undermine the whole thing. For one of the reasons that the church was so against this was that the proposed unified country was going to exclude Austria, the largest Catholic populace of all the proposed states, to be added into this confederacy. So the Catholic states were from the start at a disadvantage. They would be severely minoritarized by Bismarck because Bismarck and the liberals knew that in order for them to have this German nation that they wanted to create, that they would need a majority of secular or Protestant Germans to make up the majority of the states. And of course, his great opponent to this was the papacy, in particular Pius IX and his Pius's Curia, who released this flurry of encyclicals denouncing the liberalism of the West. And ultimately, in that case, at least in the short term, the Catholics won because Bismarck eventually had to abandon Kulturkampf, the persecutions of that, because the Catholic Germans formed a very formidable and powerful faction called the Center Party, which was influential all the way up to the point that the Nazis took over and dissolved the Center Party. You can go see that in my video on the Center Party, though you'd have to sign up for my Patreon. It's the free aspect, free part of my Patreon. If you guys, I have a Patreon, by the way, guys. I forget to like advertise my stuff, but there's free stuff on there. I took some of the videos, especially some of the more historical videos and the stuff that I put more time into. I want that to be catered to a specific audience. So you guys, if you sign up for free on my Patreon, you can find that. Now, I'm not as well versed in the history of the left all through the 19th century. It's just too much, and modernity is such a mess, as it were. But I can give you a good overview of it. And I actually think that it would be more pertinent, though, to hone in on some things about the 20th century as we are still sort of feeling the effects of some of these things. So, my wife and I are reading a book called The Long Loneliness as our next Books and Beer review. You guys, we do this Books and Beer review on Catholic literature, and my wife wanted to read Dorothy Day's book, The Long Loneliness. And while I knew that Dorothy Day had been involved in some of the leftist labor movement, I had no idea exactly how involved that she had been in it in her earlier life. And it's a super fascinating book because you guys like a book, excuse me, you guys probably don't realize just how wildly anarchic the left of the early 20th century was. And I'm talking worldwide here, the worldwide left. And anarchic in the truest sense of the word, because there's so many different groups and individuals all representing their own unique flavor and pet peeves and causes. And it's almost like impossible to keep up with them all. Because today, like our context of the left today is this fairly homogenous thing. It's been kind of consolidated around certain principles, though it's always in flux. It's not anywhere near as like loosely collated as it was in the early 20th century with this wide spectrum of divergent beliefs. And Dorothy, she's alive at this really interesting point because she is down in Greenwich Village. Now today, Manhattan, all of New York City is a gentrified, posh cesspool, bereft of anything even remotely resembling anything interesting. But back in the day, even in my lifetime, really, it was still kind of a seedy place. And Greenwich Village was the place where all the like bohemians and rejects ended up. And she was down there when Emma Goldman was there and Margaret Sanger was there. And she was even down there, actually, an interesting part. I don't want to like give you guys too much of this because we have to discuss it when the book review comes out. But she's even down there when Leon Trotsky was in exile. It's kind of wild. Like Leon Trotsky, the who would end up becoming the bloodthirsty, violent Bolshevik revolutionary, was at this time a young bohemian radical down living in the tenements in New York City. And she got to hang out with them. And of course, the Russian Revolution starts up, and he goes back in 1917 to go take part in that atrocity. But you will see all of these people represented very different elements of the left. Emma Goldman, for example, was practically a libertine anarchist. She was early in the left support for like the free love movement, the abolishment of the family. She was also, of course, very interested in the birth control movement, and in that respect, she was a fellow traveler with Margaret Sanger, though Sanger coming from the, I think, Pentecostal, or excuse me, Presbyterian, or maybe Episcopalian background, Christian background that Sanger came from. Sanger didn't agree with Emma on the licentious views of sexuality that Emma held to. And they would all kind of collectively work together, though, where their interests converged, and then they'd sort of diverge in many other areas. So it's a huge, like, just because, for example, you see Emma Goldman working with Margaret Sanger doesn't mean that they agreed on anything else other than that one thing that they were working on. It's kind of an interesting period to study the left. But the big development in all of it is, of course, the Russian Revolution, which the entire worldwide left, it sort of takes everyone by surprise, and then everyone sort of waiting with bated breath to see what's going to come of it. And you would not believe how like fascinating it is to read these people's accounts of the early period of the Russian Revolution. Like I'm talking early, like before anybody knows what's going to be happening, because you see the revolution begins in the winter of 1917. The Nicholas II abdicates the throne, right? But Lenin doesn't seize power until October the same year, later in the fall. And even then, the world is kind of like, okay, who's this Lenin guy? What's his bag all about? What's he on about? Emma Goldman, people like John Reed, the American journalist who wrote 10 Days That Changed the World, they actually traveled to Russia to write about the revolution because everyone's thinking, right? It's this moment. It's this like moment where this sort of grand things that the left has been thinking about. Which way is it going to go? And this experiment is underway, and all of the ideals of the left are in the, since the French Revolution failed, this is their moment again, right? Now Reed, he's enthralled with it all. Emma, she's a different cat. She meets Lenin, and she's witnessing the Bolsheviks shutting down all of the opposition press, including leftist press newspapers. And she's like, what's going on here, guys? She's picturing, right, like an anarchist utopia. See, because even in the U.S. in the late 19th, early 20th century, there's no real equivalent of what the Russian socialists were like. And in particular, Lenin was the most extreme of all of these, right? In his vision of what revolution would entail. Even Trotsky, right? Like Trotsky's living with them in Greenwich Village, but at that time, early on, when they're hanging out with Trotsky, he's not a Leninist. He's not a Bolshevik. He doesn't join the party until he comes back to Russia and Lenin's actually winning. That's when Trotsky, he's sort of an opportunist in that sense. So even their exposure to Trotsky was not necessarily representative of what was taking place in Russia. Lenin advocated a vanguard militant revolutionary government that suppressed, violently if need be, any obstacle to the end goal of communism. And this becomes the first great existential crisis for the left, the worldwide left. Whether you agreed with this approach or not, you were on one side of the extremism or the other. Emma, for example, for all of her ridiculousness and her dangerous notions, was really all but a pacifist who was mostly repulsed by what the Russian socialists were doing. But many in the left sided with Lenin. He became a figurehead for much of the left throughout the 20th century. Even when you go and you read, Orwell's Animal Farm, right? The first pig at the beginning, for those of you that remember Animal Farm, who is this? This is an allegory of Lenin, the good pig that dies early on in the animal revolution. Orwell wasn't against Leninism. Orwell was against Stalinism. Stalin himself became yet another line in the sand for the worldwide left, as his signing of the non-aggression pact with Hitler was a major blow for all the supporters of the Russian Revolution up to that point. Now, meanwhile, back in the States, the majority of the American public, the reaction to all of this was what's known as the Red Scare. Basically, what happened is the Americans hunted down many of the more radical elements of the left who had to go underground for many, many years. The more effective ones basically sold out and went legit. The most successful ones, of course, went on to join the New Dealers for the Roosevelt government, which, if you know anything about the New Deal movement, it was sold as the centrist solution to the Red Scare. The Red Scare was like, okay, this is the extreme threat that we face. And Great Depression hits, and then you're sort of left, okay, are we going to go for the Nazi fascist route, or are we going to go for this Bolshevik route? The New Deal was sold as a middle road between the two extremes. The underground, though, of the left never died off. Neither the more militant aspects of it nor the more pacifist. While the economic arguments of the left became more absorbed into the American Democratic Party, the social left lay dormant up through the McCarthy era of the 1950s. McCarthy being the sort of second expression of this Red Scare, the McCarthy hearings, as it were, which was designed to weed out these leftists that had gone underground and were subverting the culture. And we know now in hindsight that they did subvert the culture. They actually subverted it very successfully, which is why McCarthy is such a hated and despised figure. Flawed a man as he was, the level of animosity towards him from the left is from a specific type of leftist who knows that he was onto something. And yeah, there's the release of the Venona Papers. We know that there were active communists working in Hollywood, subverting the media and the culture and things like that. We know that was happening, but there was also a more subtle subversiveness that was taking place that really began to explode, especially when the drugs were introduced in the 1960s. the drugs and the mixing of that with the music culture, that's where everything kind of took off. It was something of a perfect storm because all of these loosely aligned bohemians in the teens and 20s now are suddenly in positions of power and influence in the 40s and 50s up and through the 60s, and their kids are, and many of their many of their pet projects become social movements, free love, abortion rights, birth control, again, all mixed up with the drug culture, which of course led us to this burnt up, dried out on life support culture that we have today. For the longest time, the right was something of a moral majority, a bulwark in the states, anyways, who really tried to rally against the onslaught of this. This is kind of where you will find people like Nixon, people like even Pat Buchanan, even people like Reagan to an extent. Though Reagan was really more of a system guy than I think he's. I don't know how you guys view these things, but right, Reagan was more of a establishment guy than we like to give credit for. But certainly Nixon was kind of an anti-establishment bulwark against a lot of this. Pat Buchanan certainly, some of these others. But today the real threat of all of this, not just from the left, but from this undercurrent as well that sort of arose out of all of these arguments, is this libertarian consumerism that is like somehow it's kind of like the most bizarre wed of extremities that you could imagine, because the libertarian consumerism is wed to these kind of bohemian aesthetics. Like that's one of the strangest things that happened in this intervening period between the 19 teens and the 1920s, and then the like hiccup of the World War in between, but then the 1950s and 60s and 70s and all these revolutions that take place, is just how consumerist it all became, right? Like even you take somebody like Che Guevara, right? And the image of Che Guevara being on t-shirts and baseball caps, and it's like that secular world got wedded to this otherwise, like you would think it was the antagonist, like Western freedom and consumerism. It's basically libertarianism. Somewhere along the way, those two things wedded together. And what we ended up with today is just the sort of cultural exhaustion of the left. And it's only sort of manifested itself, I think, in a kind of Nietzschean rise of secularism and indifference, because the left, even in the 1960s, was very, very idealistic. If you listen to that kind of like the hippie movement and the peace love movement, they've got some like high ideals. Even they weren't indifferent. These are not indifferent people that are flaming that movement, but from them to their children and their grandchildren today, it's a totally different world today. The I think, and this is going back to the beginning of this conversation, the natural outgrowth of secularism, and it's played out here. I think it's played out in real time, is a form of indifferentism. And it's affecting left and right. The right is not excused from this. One has to but look at the direction the right has taken today. I know some people want to blame Trump for this. I don't blame Trump on this. Granted, I don't necessarily, before the people on either side, it seems to be sycophants on either sides. Like, I don't blame Trump, but I know Trump's like idea was to form a coalition to get elected. I get that. I understand real politics, but after the election, the time that we're in right now, this is like a super important and interesting time that we live in, because one side or the other of this is going to win. And it's not clear to me or to anybody else. I don't think any of us know exactly who's going to win this. I'm willing to stand with someone that I disagree with to an extent. But now that we've won, now that the side that's closer, more amendable to our positions has won, I think we need to really begin pushing away from our coalition with, dare I say, sodomites, dare I say, well, let me be more kind here and more diplomatic in my language. Dare I say the secularists? Dare I say the people whose the things that they push lead to the indifferentism of two sodomites purchasing designer babies on the market like they're commodable, like they're commodities. This is supposed to be acceptable to us because they helped us get Trump elected, right? No, like these are things that need to be expunged, and they need to be expunged rather quickly. This is exactly the indifferentism that our secularism has produced, and I 100% think it'll be our undoing. We cannot be indifferent to these things. Yeah, I get it. We had to get the man elected. We have to get the people that are on our side in the positions of power to make the changes. But once they get there, we have a duty and an obligation to build up the kingdom wherever we are. And Catholics are uniquely poised in this country, I think, to kind of subvert the right, to subvert the government, culture, whatever, and push it in the direction of the true, the good, and the beautiful. I mean, you think about it, guys. We as Catholics, the Protestants are there too, don't get me wrong, but we as Catholics, we're in the highest positions of power. We can make changes now that will affect our children's children, but you kind of have to seize the moment. What that will look like, again, I think we're all going to have to wait and see. I don't know which side of this is going to win. If the secularism wins, I guarantee you that the fruit of the Trump movement, the fruit of the new right, will be indifferentism. It'll be the same old thing. You may have noticed that my slogans for this channel is combating secularism and indifference. And I think people, when it comes to Colby especially, they get kind of caught up in the masonry aspect of it. You have to be careful because Satan will change tactics when he knows you're onto them. And I think if Colby were alive today, I'm positive he would see it. It's not to say that the Freemasons aren't still nefarious. It's just to say that the existential threats that we face have shifted and morphed over the last century and a half. And so look, look, this is a small channel. I'm small fish. I don't think that there's the, there's never going to be a perfect way to do these things, but this is going to have to lead to the next talk, guys, because I'm coming up on the kind of time I want to give to this particular lecture. But the next thing that I want to cover with all of this is what does it look like to have a populist Catholic movement? And my particular thoughts on this, whatever small thing that I can add to the conversations that are taking part. It should be clear to you all to like right now that I'm not a libertarian. I don't think that I have to be careful about this. I do believe in the principle of subsidiarity, and I do believe there's an extent to which bringing things down to the local level, we can actually make some real and effective changes. But I think that those kinds of changes are generational and they're important and they need to take place. But the changes at the higher level, we're in kind of a bad way. I was just talking. I wasn't actually. I was didn't engage with them too much on it, but one of the guys out there who I think has spoke on this a little bit is Scholastic Answers. Is he still Scholastic Answers? He might have changed the channel name. Christian Wagner has talked on the problem of how the pro-life movement, for example, we sort of failed to step up to the plate when Roe was overturned. This is a prime example of where we are like these opportunities arise and we don't have a Catholic. I would say my personal belief is that we need a Catholic vanguard movement. It doesn't have to be large, but it has to be dedicated and it has to be orthodox and serious, and it has to be in positions where we can make like effective changes because kicking the abortion issue back down to the states has not paid off for us so far. It's actually been kind of nightmarish for us. And it could have been a good opportunity for us had we been prepared. But again, we live in the outgrowth of right and like we know the left, guys. Like you know that the left is failed on many aspects. There are certain things like when the left abandoned labor, when the American left abandoned labor, it was sort of the last bastion, in my opinion, of like the good cause that the left could bring out about in a dialectic sense. But the right, the sort of last bastion of the kind of social things that we want to push for. That's look at what's happening, guys. Look at what's happening. I think the abortion case is a prime example. One state after another has capitulated and basically enshrined abortion at the state level. And I think this is a result of the right taking the secularism pill and the resulting indifferentism that slips into that. Because again, as I was going to say, the next part of this that I want to lead all this to lead to is to talk about things like freedom of indifference and the what's the word I'm looking for? The I'm sorry, I got distracted by some comments here. I'm just going to turn to the comments, guys. I see quite a few are coming in. Morning papists. Yes. Good morning, papists. Every single one of you. Unionist. I see you there in the comments. A lot of Lenin is following Engels Marx over Kautsky. Kautsky essentially advocated a strategy similar to Hitler, where you select the SDP party members and build a parallel worker army. You know an interesting thing about Lenin, though? More so than Marx, even, Lenin said that the number one influence on him was Cherhovsky, who wrote a book called What Is to Be Done. And it was a populist book. It was actually a piece of fiction, literature, that was this massive hit in Russia, and it's almost unreadable. But yeah, no, like the idea of this was that you needed, and this is where I think the fruit of Leninism comes from, was that you needed a small, and actually, this is where I think with certain aspects of the left, we should be co-opting where they were effective. I do think that the vanguardism of Lenin is a practical, realpolitik approach that we could be taking. Sans communism, sans Marxism, right? But the idea that you have a small contingent of people that are dedicated to a cause. There was, gosh, who was it that said? I think it was another kind of bad person, but Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell said, "If you give me 16 men dedicated to a cause, I'll defeat an army of thousands every time." And I think that is the kind of like the exact opposite of indifferentism, and with secularism, the exact opposite of that is a sort of dedicated small vanguard. Trump probably needs to deal with the internet problem first. So much of this is due to our children's access to the internet. I kind of wish he would. I mean, Trump is one of these guys. What will I say about Trump? Where Trump is good, he's very good. Where he's not so good, I don't think it's necessarily that he's not good. I think it's that the people that have his ear, I think Trump could be influenced in the right direction, and we have to pray that the right people get to him. I have a feeling if the right person got to him, I have a feeling that Trump would be willing to pass some things if he were able to see, and I totally agree with what you're saying here. If he were able to see, like for example, what the peddlers of filth have pushed through the internet has done to subvert, because he and Elon both seem to be very concerned with the social question. I think the problem with Elon, though, is he's still in that libertarian mindset, which I don't think he sees the fruit of libertarianism as indifference. But if we could like subtly bring Elon on board and maybe get to the ear of Trump, I'm saying we loosely, I have nothing to do with any of this, but if the right people, we need to be praying that the right people get to his ear, because I actually do think unionist initiative, that if we were to put the kind of restrictions on the internet that you would find in certain other countries, then we would actually see really good fruit of that. All right. Well, since Unionist said it, I'll say it too. I was thinking that Unionist. It's been done in China, and I know people that have gone to China, and they're like, yeah, like the internet is locked down. The internet's locked down way more than people realize, and even in places like I think I've heard Dubai before. I don't know. I have a lot that I want to say about the cultural context of this stuff, but it's going to have to be for a future conversation. A says, Brian, I'm from India. Overpopulation seems to be a problem here. All the arguments here for contraception is built upon this supposed fact. Is there any sort of population control moral solution? Gosh, that's a big question. That when you start when you so I'm going to say I know my strengths and my weaknesses, and one of my areas that's actually a real weakness for me is in moral theology. And if I were to start pontificating on the moral aspects of a place that I actually do think has issues with population density. I don't know enough about India to be able to say, like, are there practical things that we could do to ease some of the like ecological stress and the economic stress that a like densely populated place like India faces without having to revert to things like birth control. I think birth control is just one of those like easy outs, you know. It's like an easy solution to a complex problem, and you're also begin tinkering with, I mean, just leaving aside the sort of ethical conundrum of it. I think when you start tinkering with things like birth control in nature, we have enough background and evidence behind us in the West and in other countries where we have experimented with this stuff to say that you kind of end up with the other extreme, which is an absolute population collapse. And I do believe, unlike some people, some demographers out there, I do think that part of the collapse of Western demographics is due to the rise of the birth control movement. I know correlation doesn't always equal causation, but it also doesn't not equal it either. And I do think that there is some corollary between the introduction of the birth control. So if you want to have a healthy, sustained population, I think we have enough evidence that birth control and contraceptives are not the solution. They're not the, even just on a secular level, it's not the cure all that we want it to be. Yeah, I think Elon is way more sinister because although he boosts the right wing voices and is for free speech, he's just setting the rules to be in setting the rules to be in an insane place. Yeah, the only thing I'll say about Elon, and I'll end it here, is I hope I hope the right people influence him. I think because my understanding with I don't know a lot about what's going on with him and what's happened with him is that he's historically been very libertarian, and he's only recently moved sort of right recently. So the problem is we don't have a lot of time, and he's got a lot of power and a lot of money to influence a lot of things, and we really could use him on our side. So I don't know. I mean, if the right people could influence, I think he could be influenced, but it's really going to take the right people getting his ear. It's not going to be, you know, Joe Rogan's not going to convince him. Andrew Tate's not going to like. We need like solid. We need like. I mean, for all of his faults, we need like a. Gosh, who am I thinking of? Like a Michael Knowles or somebody like that, right? We need just like a nice dude that would like Elon would listen to, right? That like speaks the truth well. You know what I mean? Like in a friendly kind of way, not like coming at Elon hostile. I think he could be influenced in the right direction. And he could do, man, Elon could do a lot of good with just a little nudge, you know what I mean, on some of these like things that he's not quite worked out correctly yet. So anyways, guys, that's what I got for this one. We're a little over an hour. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I will have a follow up for this one that is going to go into again I think there's always the fruits of the fruits of the fruits, right? So the fruits of secularism is indifference, and I'm going to go into next what the fruits of indifferentism is. And I think we're at a crossroads here. I can't say whether the fruits of indifferentism are going to lead us, whether there's going to be a reaction out of that, or whether it's going to be more down the rabbit hole of sort of sinister things. But I do think, in terms of what we face today, the truly satanic movement that we are up against today, it has subverted both right and left. The right and left paradigms are, and Elon's kind of a good example of this. The right and Trump's kind of a good example of this too. The right and left paradigms almost been completely subverted. So Catholics, I think, we've got that moral, ethical foundation that we can sort of land ourselves upon, And the unique thing is that we're in positions of, just think of the Supreme Court, for example, right? There's some interesting things I heard that are going to be coming down the pike with the Supreme Court. Well, God willing, the next justice who comes in, maybe we'll get another Catholic in there. I think we've got 6 out of the 9. That's a phenomenal feat that we have managed to do with a minority religion in this country that's actually the country at times has been kind of hostile towards. So that's a major, major victory on our part and a major subversion on our part to kind of come in and manage that kind of feat. And I think it's God's hands at work there. But yeah, there's certain like things that are downstream of all of this that we'll discuss in the future. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Take care. God bless.